Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everyone is just as excited for our keynote session as I am. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of welcoming a living legend. And to welcome him, Amy Romero will not only be introducing him, but also our friend and esteemed guest from the First Circuit. Amy Romero is an assistant United States attorney for the District of Rhode Island. A proud graduate of Providence Public Schools, Amy focuses her work as an AUSA on the enforcement of federal civil rights laws here in Rhode Island. Thank you, Amy.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that everybody enjoyed their morning panels, the lunch, the company of each other. I am so glad that we are able to be here in person to spend time grappling with these difficult but extremely important conversations around racial and social justice. I'm especially glad for the opportunity to gather together in conversation with and celebration of our esteemed colleague, living legend, civil rights attorney, Fred Gray. Yes. I'm here to introduce Mr. Gray to you all, but how does one introduce a person whose reputation precedes him? A person whose almost 70 years worth of life's work in pursuit of civil rights has changed the course of history. As Josh mentioned, I have the honor of enforcing federal civil rights laws in Rhode Island. Well, Mr. Gray is the reason why many of those laws exist, directly and indirectly. It's humbling, to say the least. It's tempting to stand here and recite Mr. Gray's many, many achievements, and doing so would be worthwhile for the chance it would afford us to recognize and reflect upon each one. But honestly, that list is so long, it would leave no time for the man himself to speak. So, I'm just gonna offer a highlight reel of sorts and encourage you to read more about Mr. Gray whenever and as often as you can. Conveniently, you can start with the bio in your program, and after that, you can pick up a copy of his 1995 autobiography, Bus Ride to Justice. I promise you, as someone who has recently finished it, you will not be able to put it down. Born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1930, Mr. Gray grew up amidst the oppression and brutality of racial segregation. He studied to be a minister and traveled as a preacher, but by the late 1940s, his urge to fight the injustices of segregation, to dismantle the systems, had become another calling. After receiving his undergraduate degree from Alabama State, Mr. Gray earned his JD from Case Western Reserve in Ohio. He went to Ohio to study law because Alabama law schools would not admit black students. Years later, he would receive an honorary Doctor of Law degree from Alabama State, along with honorary degrees from a dozen other universities. But I'm getting a few decades ahead of myself. So back in the 1950s, Mr. Gray began his legal career where he hoped to be most helpful, his hometown of Montgomery. There, as one of only 2 black lawyers in town, he challenged the legality of segregation. He did this by representing such now historical figures as Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He did it by helping to plan the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and with his 1956 victory in Browder v. Gale, successfully integrating buses in Montgomery. Now, if anyone's been paying attention, he was born in 1930, and in 1956, he had successfully integrated the bus system. He was 26 years old. Okay. And he was just getting started. In the 1960s, Mr. Gray's seminal cases secured voting rights, defended students' right to due process, and protected protesters in the Selma to Montgomery March, leading to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, an act that our office enforces. Mr. Gray also filed lawsuits that resulted in the desegregation of schools throughout Alabama. It's hard to fathom how Mr. Gray found time to serve as a preacher while maintaining such a busy law practice, but he did, and he remains active in Churches of Christ today. The two occupations are complementary, different ways to help others similarly fueled by ethics, dedication, passion, and compassion. Mr. Gray's approach has always exemplified these qualities, as seen in the 1970s, when he represented the victims of the Tuskegee syphilis study. The settlement in this case yielded $10 million and medical treatment, and more importantly, led to federal laws protecting human research subjects. In addition to a trailblazing, precedent-setting legal career and benevolent work in the ministry, Mr. Gray has also served in the Alabama legislature, as well as president of the National Bar Association and president of the Alabama Bar. Last year, the street he grew up on in Montgomery, which had been named for a leader of the Confederacy, was renamed for him. And he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Biden this past July. As we all know, the battle for equality in this country rages on, more so now than ever. And Mr. Gray still heads the charge, continuing to work as a civil rights attorney at a young 91 years of age. We thank him for his company today, for his remarkable body of work, and for the many meaningful ways he has raised the bar for all of us here in the room. We also extend a warm welcome and sincere thanks to the Honorable Roger Thompson, and who will be joining Mr. Gray in a special discussion ahead. Judge Thompson has served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit since 2010, after being the first African American and second woman to be confirmed as a judge on the court. Prior to that, she served as a judge on the Rhode Island Superior Court and on Rhode Island District Court, and was the first African American woman to serve on each. Judge Thompson received her bachelor's degree from Brown University and her JD from Boston University, and began her legal career, where I also began my legal career, Rhode Island Legal Services. She also worked in private practice and as an assistant city solicitor for Providence. Her dedication to public service has been widely recognized and includes, among other accomplishments, working with the Rhode Island Supreme Court to bring certified court interpreters to the state courts. She has served on numerous committees and boards, received a number of awards for her achievement, and holds multiple honorary degrees. I will now turn the floor over to Judge Thompson and to Mr. Gray. Thank you.
What do you do when you've heard an introduction like that? It's good to consider the take in, but not to be too disturbed by it. I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction. And if I were do what I probably should do, I just said thank you very much for that. She's told you all about what I've done, and continue with your conference. But if I would do that, you know what? Some of you would be disappointed. So I want to simply thank her for those wonderful remarks. I want to also thank the Rhode Island Federal District Court for having this conference. I've been invited to participate and make presentations at various and sundry meetings. I was trying to remember during my 68 years of law practice whether I have ever had a federal district court conference to invite me to be the keynote speaker at their event. So I want to thank the court. I want to thank the committee who is responsible for selecting me. Most of the times when I'm invited to places, I kind of know how I got where I am. Usually somebody will tell me something. But you know what? I really don't know how I got here. I got a communication from one of these speech agencies that I've made some speeches for, indicating that they were looking for a speaker and they thought I might be what they're looking for. But I also know that once they go back, somebody somewhere says something that causes things to happen. So whoever it is who did whatever you did to make sure I could be here, I want to thank you so much for it. I want to thank my wife, Carol. We are a second marriage. I'd been married to one person for about 40-some years. She had been married to another person for some 30 years, didn't know each other. And that was a couple who knew both of us and felt sorry for us and thought that if they could introduce us, we just might be able to establish a life. And for 22 years, she said she'd never been to Alabama till she met me, and I'm from Alabama, she's from Cleveland. And for 22 years, she has kept her commitment of taking care of me, and thank you, Carol, she's still doing it. I want to particularly thank the members of the court system who have arranged these arrangements for us, and we're just delighted you're here. Since being here, I have several persons have come up and reminded me of certain instances where we met. And for all of you who have done that, I want to thank you for reminding me of it. And it's interesting how these things work sometimes, but they do happen. If I have missed anybody that I should have said something about, consider me having said it because I didn't intend to omit you. The theme for the court's conference, as I understand it, is racial and social justice in the federal courts. I'm not sure what is social justice in the federal courts. And maybe when you complete your conference here this afternoon, you'll know and may be able to share that information with me. However, I have had substantial experience about racial justice, or lack of it, in the federal courts. My first experience filing a federal suit concerning racial justice was the case of Browder et al. Versus Gale, who was the mayor of the city of Montgomery. And that was filed, at least that was as a result of an incident which occurred on the suit was filed, Browder versus Gale was filed on February the 2nd, 1955, in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. While that was my first federal suit case, that was not my first civil rights case. My first civil rights case was for a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin, who lived in Montgomery, Alabama, in the northeast part, and who used the public transportation system. And they had been studying, and she was arrested on March the 2nd, 1955. And it was right after Black History Month program, which was in February. And they had been studying about the constitutional rights that African Americans had. And she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white person in the city of Montgomery. The city of Montgomery charged Claudette, who was only 15 years old, with one, violating the Montgomery segregation laws requiring segregation of the races on city buses, two, assaulting a police officer, and 3 disorderly conduct. She was tried in the Montgomery County Juvenile Court and was found to be a delinquent and placed in the unsupervised supervision of her parents with no other punishment. That was my first civil rights case. That case was before Judge Hill, who was the juvenile court judge. And I tried to tell the judge, who was very respectful to me, that while these people, the city of Montgomery had charged her with these 3 offenses, what they were really concerned with was enforcing the segregation laws of the city of Montgomery, and those laws were unconstitutional. The court was very generous, very considerate, listened to me, and found her to be a delinquent and placed her on unsupervised probation. I was ready then to file a suit on behalf of Claudette and her, done so by her parents because she was a minor, but the city of Montgomery wasn't quite ready. Later on, 6 months later, on December 1st, 1955, Mrs. Rosa Parks, who I had known from my college days at Alabama State, she had been a very active worker in the NAACP, secretary of the branch, as well as director of the youth conference. And I'd met her when I was going to college at Alabama State. So I knew her. But after Claudette's arrest in March and Mrs. Parks' arrest in December, it ignited what has become known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And that Montgomery Bus Boycott, with Mrs. Parks' arrest and Claudette Colvin's arrest, ignited the Montgomery Bus Boycott and propelled Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to become an international leader. It also was the beginning of my career. That career included cases, as you have heard from the introduction, filed in federal courts that eliminated racial discrimination in almost every aspect of American law. And you've heard some of them about the public transportation system in Montgomery, Browder versus Gale, Gomillion v. Lightfoot, when they gerrymandered blacks out of the city of Tuskegee to keep them from getting persons elected. And it resulted ultimately in various federal cases being filed so that people would not be gerrymandered, so that they wouldn't have the right to vote. Later on, I represented the people in what is generally known as the Selma to Montgomery March, when in 1965, when the blacks decided they wanted to march from Selma to Montgomery in order to get to protest the right to vote, and they beat them. When they beat them on that Sunday, they called me up, and I went across the bridge. And before the close of day, before the close of business on Monday, I filed the case of Hosea Williams, Congressman Lewis, and Mrs. Borington versus the governor, George Wallace, which resulted in the Voting Rights Act, as you've heard about. I'm happy to have been instrumental in helping to file lawsuits. And in all these cases, I don't tell you that Fred Gray did it, because when I was retained to represent the people in the Montgomery Bus Boycott case, which is what I wanted to do, but I had enough sense to know that I was no competition for the lawyers that they would have in Alabama on the other side. I'd heard about and read about Thurgood Marshall, got him on the phone, asked him if I could, told him what had happened in Montgomery. He had read about it in the paper. He invited me there, and he supplied for me with the NACP and later the NACP Defense and Educational Fund. From that third week in December until today's date, I've been working, and that organization, along with many other organizations, in doing these cases. In addition to that, we filed lawsuits, as you know, that desegregated all of the institutions from kindergarten through graduate school. And then there was a question of farm subsidies, Henderson versus Macon County ASCS, where the federal government was giving a lot of money to farmers, but black people didn't get it because the community committees that decided who got it were all white. We didn't get any money when we filed the case of Henderson versus Macon County ASCS. But years later, there were African-American farmers' descendants who did get some money, and they're still litigating, but we set the case for it. You heard a little something about the Tuskegee syphilis study, and your earlier case, the murder that was mentioned, I heard something about that as I was sitting back there. So then, you know a little something about the cases I have been involved in, but if you want to know a little bit more, there are at least 3 books that you can order, and they have some forms here for it. Bus Ride to Justice, the autobiography, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, which will tell you really the real story as to what happened. And then the most recent one is one that I co-authored with Dan Abram and David Fisher, Alabama versus King. However, African Americans, ever since slavery time, have been struggling since 1608 in this country, trying their best to receive racial justice. And while I wish I could tell you that we have been successful in all our endeavors, I can tell you that we've done some, but the struggle continues. I was born in Montgomery, Alabama on December 14th, 1930. In a little better than a month, I will be 92 years of age. I was delivered by a midwife at home rather than a hospital, which was a common practice then for African Americans. I lived in an all-black community, attended an all-black school, went to an all-black church. When an African American died, they were buried in a black cemetery. So everything was segregated based on race. When I came up, from the time you were born until you died, and enforced by the Alabama Constitution of 1901, which was designed primarily to discriminate against African Americans and poor whites. At that time, I knew nothing at all about lawyers. And I knew nothing at all about what lawyers did. The only thing I knew as far as professionally for black men as I grew up, you either be a preacher or you be a teacher, and if you did it on a segregated basis because everything was segregated. At an early age, I was a student at Alabama State College for Negroes, now Alabama State University. I had to use the public transportation system, as all African Americans, most of them did at that time, because we didn't have any automobiles. And we were required to get up and give whites our seats when all the first 10 seats were taken. I decided to go ahead and finish Alabama State. They told me that lawyers help people to solve problems. And I concluded that after going to Alabama State, I wanted to become a lawyer and help to solve some of the problems in Montgomery. And Alabama, African Americans had problems. And I found out not only just on buses, but on every aspect of American life. I decided I was going to finish Alabama State not even applied to the University of Alabama Law School because I knew they weren't going to accept me, and I didn't want to raise any sand. I was going to finish law school. But at that time, if the University of Albany or Alabama or University of Alabama offered courses in graduate schools that was not offered at the historical black schools, Alabama State, Tuskegee, and Alabama A&M, then the state of Alabama would pay a portion of that tuition, room, and board. And I said, I'm going to take advantage of that. I enrolled in what is now case Western Reserve in Cleveland in September of 1951. Finished in 3 years in June of 54. And I had a desire, and I didn't tell anybody about this. My desire was to go to law school, come back to Alabama, pass the Alabama bar, and at that time, if you took the Alabama, if you attended the University of Alabama and graduated, you didn't even have to take a bar exam. Pass the bar exam, become a lawyer in Alabama, and destroy everything segregated I could find. And the best thing about that is I kept it a secret, and I told people about being a lawyer, but not about the best. I finished. But I had enough sense when I graduated in June to stop by the Columbus and take the Ohio bar exam just in case. Then in July, I took the Alabama bar exam. And in August, I was told by both Alabama and Ohio I had passed the best, and I am now ready to begin my journey of destroying everything segregated I could find. Looking back now, 68 years after my admission to the bar, after having received many honorary degrees and various awards, tributes, and honors, I never imagined that I would be invited by the Rhode Island Federal District Court to come and make a speech to you. And to do it on racial and social justice. When I filed those suits that you've heard about and you can read about, I was only concerned with obtaining for African Americans the rights that other citizens of the United States enjoyed. However, you invited me here, and guess what? I'm here. As a teenager in Montgomery, as I've indicated to you, I didn't know anything about how to do it, but I'm happy to say that during these periods of time, I believe some of the things that we've been able to do have helped to change the racial landscape in this country, and probably had some effect around the world. The federal courts have played an active role in providing constitutional rights for African Americans in almost every aspect of life. The history, however, and I'm about ready to let the judge ask some questions.
I think he's covered it all.
The history of the civil rights movement must be preserved for present and future generations. We have a whole 2 or 3 generations of people now who know nothing about hardcore segregation. And if we don't teach them, they won't know. And if they don't have in these various communities museums that will teach them, they will not know. 25 years ago, we founded, and I helped to develop in Tuskegee, a history museum, the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, also known as the Tuskegee History Center. It helps to educate the public on the contributions made by the 3 ethnic groups in this country. Native Americans, who we used to call Indians, Americans of European descent, who came from Europe, and took the land away from Native Americans. And they brought with them their slaves from Africa, of European or of African descent. So you have Native Americans, Americans of European descent, Americans of African descent. Under one roof, you can see the contributions that these groups have made. And there have been a lot of problems. We've been able to solve some. Haven't solved them all. But if you could see it all, the theory of establishing the museum was that you can see it all under one roof at the same time and see that we've made some contributions. Whatever our problems are now, we'll be able to solve them. That's one of the purposes of that museum. The second purpose of that museum, and really it's the one that's caused it to be at the time it was, and that is the men that I represented in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. After I finally was able to find out where the records were that the government said they couldn't find, and after we were able to get as much money as we thought we could get from the federal government, considering the facts in our case, and after agreeing, working with others, and getting an apology made by President Clinton to the men, they said, "Lawyer, we want you to do one more thing for us. We want a permanent memorial in Tuskegee where people can come and see what we've done." All of those men are dead. I promised them before their death, those that were still living, that I would do everything I can. But for the last 25 years, we have worked. Didn't get a lot of money from a lot of big corporations or from the federal government, but I've used it basically in making speeches where the little speeches I've made, instead of giving an honorarium to me, give it to the center. That's the way we have done it. We believe if you were interested enough in inviting me to come up here to make a speech to you about racial and social justice in the federal courts, that you are interested in helping us keep that facility available. We urge you and invite you to come and see it. Thank you.
Attorney Gray, first of all, you honor us by your presence here, and on behalf of everyone in this room, I want to thank you for your willingness to speak to us today. Thank you. I told Attorney Gray today that I listened to a speech that he gave in 2009 out in California at a Republican roundtable. I don't know if you remember that. But he started off by reciting this poem that I wanted to share with you, because by the time I got to the end of it, I cried. And I hadn't heard it before, so I looked it up, and it's called A Bag of Tools. And it goes, "Isn't it strange that princes and kings and clowns that caper in sawdust rings and common people like you and me are builders for eternity? Each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mass, a book of rules, and each must make, ere life is flown, a stumbling block or a stepping stone." And when I think about Attorney Gray, he is definitely not a stumbling block, but he most assuredly is a stepping stone for all of us. We stand on his tall shoulders because it is the work that he has done that has enabled us to be here. I'm not sure if all of you are aware of this, but black people down south used to be lynched en masse. Every 4 days, there was a lynching or a burning between 1880 and 1950s. Every 4 days. During that time, there was a quiet exodus of black people from the South that's known as the Great Migration. 6 million black people left the South to avoid essentially torture. Attorney Gray, you chose to stay. You didn't join the great exodus from the South. Why did you do that?
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the only reason I became a lawyer, see, I grew up in a very religious environment, and I won't go into details about that. You'll have to read about it in the book. But the point is, I found out that we had some real problems in Montgomery. I'd gone off to school to learn how to be a preacher, learn a little something about it, so I could be a preacher. Then I came back to Montgomery, decided to become a teacher. And it was during that time when I really realized how horrid the life I had lived, but I didn't know it because everything was completely segregated, and that was just the way it was. And they told me that lawyers helped people solve problems. And I said, well, we black people in Montgomery, and I'm an upper teenager now, we have some problems. And I decided I was going to try to get myself in a position where I could help, not do it myself, because it wasn't just for me, but for the help. And I didn't know about all the other minorities. All I knew basically about were black minorities. Blacks and white was it. And that's what caused me to go on my journey of deciding to try to do it. I didn't know whether it would work or not. And I think as I look back, we've been able, with a lot of help from a lot of people and a lot of organizations, a lot of people, we've made some progress, but the struggle continues.
Attorney Gray, I think people would be interested in hearing about the school that you attended. You attended, from what I understand, a religious boarding school? Tell us about that. Because I don't think a lot of people know that there were these kinds of schools for black people back then.
Well, in Montgomery, my parents were, and I am, a member of the Church of Christ, which is considered one of your conservative churches. And we had a preacher who preached for our little church in Montgomery, and it's still on the corner of Columbia and Holt Street, 1 block from Holt Street Baptist Church, where the bus boycott started, all on the west side of town. And they say that my father used to take all the kids in the community to church, and the preacher said I would take cats and dogs and baptize them. That's what he talked about. They had to be baptized to be saved. And he said, well, there is a black Church of Christ school for black boys up in Nashville. And we need to send Fred to that school. My father died when I was 2. Don't know how they did it, but he was instrumental in getting me up to the school in Nashville. And it was a Church of Christ supported school, like several others, as Lipscomb University in Nashville is one, Pepperdine out in California, Oklahoma Christian in Oklahoma, and others. But when I finished the little high school there, and the black president of the school had been supported in his work by a white person who was a businessman in Nashville who also supported Lipscomb University, and they supported this school. So he decided that his job was to go out, go to these black churches, get some financial support, as well as some students for the school. And he said one way he was going to do that is take these little black preachers who was boys learning to be preachers, and he took me around, and I was one of his first boy preachers back in the 40s who traveled us from throughout the Southeast and as far west as Texas and Oklahoma to recruit students. And we recruited those students. And then, so then it was that when I got back and decided that we had problems, so the church is one thing, and we never want to stop it. And I know when I went and told my mother that I had been admitted to law school, she didn't know anything about law school. She said, well, as long as you do what's right. It's all right, but I don't ever want you to stop preaching. She died at 97, and I delivered her eulogy when she died. But it was that gave me that opportunity. But now that we're through with the preaching aspect, we get to the lawyer aspect. And you know, that same school up in Nashville, Christian University, that I could not attend, even though we were members of the same church, to go to college when I finished, that school now is one of the major supporters of the museum in Tuskegee, and they have named their Department of Law, Administration of Justice, the Fred D. Gray Institute of Law, Justice, and all.
Attorney Gray, when you talk about what you did to integrate the bus system in Montgomery, I mean, I was a child of segregation also. I grew up in the segregated South Carolina. I remember a story that happened to me when I was in elementary school. I went to a Catholic school, and we were trained that you gave up your seat for the white kids, and we took the bus back and forth from school every day, and we had to get up when the white kids got on. We decided one day that we had just had enough of that. All of us had squirt guns that we filled with ink. And right before we were all getting ready to get off the bus downtown to take a transfer to another bus, we hit all of those white kids with ink and jumped off the bus and ran. That was our way of protesting. What happened, though, is that the nuns called us in to find out why we had so misbehaved. And the end result was that they changed our school time so that we had to go earlier so that we didn't overlap with those kids anymore. I think that this audience would be interested in knowing a little bit more about the suit and what happened when you were just trying to integrate the public transportation system.
Well, Montgomery had an interesting little situation. Part of it was by law and part of it was by custom. They said, when we got to a point of contesting it, that the first 10 seats would always be reserved for whites, and the last 10 seats would always be reserved for blacks, because whites would never get that far back, so you never got in a problem about what happened to the last 10 seats. But the real problem was, once those 10 seats were taken and additional white people came on the bus, then they would ask the blacks who were in the first 4 seats, 2 on each side, to get up and give the white people, even though it may be just one white person, then you get up to give one white person, and these other 3 seats are vacant. And you had that type situation. But in Claudette Colvin's case, she was all the way back in the first seat from the back of the bus. So we felt that was wrong. A man had been killed as a result of an altercation on the bus. We felt that was wrong. And then Joanne Robinson, who was a teacher at Alabama State back as far as 48, had a problem on a bus that was almost empty, that the bus driver wanted her to follow in the back. And even before then in Montgomery, the historians tell us that black folks, when they had streetcars, even protest against the way they were being treated, and they were able to desegregate it for a while, but then the Constitution was changed. So we've had problems, but the interesting thing is you had these 2 women who in Montgomery did what they did, not Joanne Robinson, but Mrs. Parks and Claudette Colvin. And of course, Joanne Robinson was interested in getting the community involved. So when that case came up, all I was concerned with was filing a lawsuit because I knew ultimately that's what it was going to take. But what Ms. Robinson was concerned with was getting the community involved in it, because she said there's more involved than just this problem. If we can get the community involved with this problem, then we'll have them involved in all the other problems. And while they didn't let us do it with Claudette's case initially, once they saw that it needed to be done, and once the protests had started and Dr. King's house was burned, then they said the time is now, and that was the beginning of it, and the beginning of getting mass participation. So all the massness that you see now, and in order for us to have the Montgomery Bus Boycott, as you'll see in Bus Ride to Justice, Joanne Robinson and I sat in her living room and made the plans for it. It didn't just happen. If we had not made the plans for it, there would never have been a protest. Mrs. Parks would never have gotten arrested, and the bus boycott would never have occurred. We never would have heard of Martin Luther King. The civil rights movement that started would never have occurred. I'm not saying these things would not have occurred later on, because they would have occurred later. But it would not have occurred then. We made the plans. We got the community involved. We executed the plans. And of course, first you have to see the problem. You have to recognize the problem. Once you recognize the problem, come up with a plan, execute your plan, and who knows, you may be able to solve your problem.
Attorney Gray, when COVID hit, and when vaccines were developed, there was a real reluctance in minority communities to get vaccinated. And when asked about what the reluctance was based upon, everybody would cite back to, they're not going to experiment on me like they did with those men in Tuskegee. Could you just tell us more information about what exactly went on with those experiments that lasted for so many years, and how did people find out what was going on?
I've written a book. And a copy of it, they have one copy out there. You can order it if you want it. It's in paperback, and it doesn't cost very much. But the title of it is,
members of his institution.
the title of it is The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Now, there have been a lot of people who have gotten a lot of money for grants, federal, local, and otherwise. And most of those people are people who didn't know anything about it other than they read about it. But let me tell you how I became involved in it, and I think that might help us to know where we are.
Yes.
I had been to Washington, D.C. in July of 1972 for something. I don't remember what it was. But on the way back on a plane from Washington to Atlanta, I saw a story in the Washington Post written by Gene Heller. Gene Heller was an AP reporter who was talking about these black men in Macon County, Alabama, who had been used as penny gigs, in effect, in a study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. And it had been going on for some 40 years then. And a whistleblower out in California knew about it, told him about it. Federal government did nothing about it, and finally the story came out. I had not heard anything about it, and I'd lived in Tuskegee in Macon County since 1963, 62, or 63. And I thought I was knowledgeable about most things that took place there. And 2 days later, a man named Charlie Pollard came into my office on the 27th of July, 1972. he had a copy of the local Montgomery Advertiser paper, and in that paper, it told the story about these men. And Mr. Pollard told me, he says, "Lawyer, I'm one of those men." And I didn't know it. They told us that they would treat us for whatever was wrong with us. And they told some of us we had bad blood. But I think the government has mistreated me. And I want to know if you can do something to help me. And I told Mr. Pollard, I think I can. That was the beginning. I told him then to go back and contact the other men who were in the program, bring them in, come in, and we'll see what we could do. That was my introduction of that story. I found out as I began to look into it, and I had to file, if I was going to, the federal government was the one involved in it. So we only had 1 year from the time you find out about it to file a lawsuit. So if anything is going to happen at all on Tuskegee syphilis, it's going to have to be done within a year. So I started looking and doing the little investigating I could, and I couldn't find anything. I even contacted the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund was not in then, the NAACP. Talked to Jack Greenberg, who was then the executive director of it, and asked them about the possibility of helping me. Like I'd helped them in the NAACP versus Alabama, and they had helped me in Browder versus Gale, and I'd helped them in the school desegregation cases. And he said, well, Fred, you know, this is a potentially fee-generating case, and we can't help you. But he did get me in touch with Dean Solvent, who was dean of Columbia Law School, who got me in touch with one of his law professors. And they said, well, we can't serve as counsel of record for you, but we can serve as a consultant. I tried to get other civil rights lawyers and other personal injury lawyers across the country to agree to work with me on a contingent fee basis and pick up the tab for deferring the cause. And guess what? I couldn't find not one who did it. And it's going to take some money. I then go to my banker, who's a white banker in town that I knew quite well, told him about it. He says, well, Fred, we understand your problem. You said the bank has the money and we can lend the money and we think you'll pay us back, but we can't lend it to you on a continuing fee basis. You're going to have to pay the bank whether you win or lose. But he said, what I can do, I can set the loan up so that it won't be due until you know whether you're going to get paid or not, or you're going to get anything out of it. I had to go and borrow thousands of dollars that I didn't know what was going to happen to. But I borrowed the money. And then I received a phone call from a man named Jim Jones, who was a historian, had done a lot of work on syphilis. He told me that he had read about I was representing these men, and he says, guess what? I said, what? He said, I know where those records are. I said, what? He got my attention. I got on a plane, I went to Washington, got with Jim Jones, he showed me those records in 400 and some boxes in the National Archives. Wow. And I had then filed this lawsuit, and when I filed the lawsuit, a lot of these men were dead. And Judge Johnson, I tried to do it, I knew better, without having to have a personal representative on the dead estates. And you know what he told me? He says, for every person who is dead, you got to have a personal representative appointed. We had to get 400 and some administrations appointed, all within a year, and had to pay the court costs for getting it done. To make a long story short, once we got the records together, told the government where it was, demanded that they produce them. Then they started talking about settlement. We got settlement, and then it went from one step to the other. But the struggle continues. That's the beginning of it, but it'll tell you the whole story. There are people who have made a lot of money on the back of these men. And eventually, we ended up settling it, and guess what? The lawyer got a little money too, but he didn't know it.
Attorney Gray, I think all of us remember Charlottesville that happened a few years ago with white nationalists marching, talking about Jews not replacing them. I was surprised when I talked to you the other day because he was at his office working at 92, and you said that you had to run out because you were working on a case to move some kind of monument. And one of the flashpoints for the Charlottesville March was that they were trying to move a Confederate monument off the campus. Are you able to tell us a little bit about what that case is about that you're working on right now?
Well, we don't know what's going to ultimately happen on that case, and it's still pending. It's still pending, so I don't want to say too much about it. But I can tell you the facts of it, and then you can decide whether you think it's right or not. In 1906, the Macon County, Alabama, which is where Tuskegee is the county seat, but it's now Tuskegee University is located, and where Booker T. Washington did his work, and George Washington Carver did his work. The population has always been about 80% black, even during slavery time. They decided, of course, all the law enforcement officials then and all of the elected officials were white. The white governing body, they had a courthouse that was on about almost a 2-acre tract right in the heart of downtown Tuskegee. They decided they wanted to change the courthouse to the northeast corner of the square. And the Tuskegee chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy contacted the governing body and asked the governing body to give to them this land where they're going to move the courthouse from. And they wanted to use it for the following purpose. One, to have a park for white people, and to build in that park a monument for the men from Macon County who had fought in the war between the states. Of course, all those men, as you know, were white from Macon County in any event. But they also kind of realized that what they were doing may or may not be right. So they had a reverter provision put in the resolution and in the deed that was ultimately filed, saying if at any time the land cannot be used for that purpose, and it was one purpose with two prongs, one, to have the white park, and two, to have the monument for these men who were white also, then if for any reason it didn't, then it would automatically revert to the county. Well, they ended up building a monument, and over the years, it has been there. The county didn't know about all the details of this, but when the county changed about some years ago, they asked that an opinion be written, and an opinion was written, and our firm wrote it back in about 1913. Not only 1913, I mean 2013. There is a difference of 100 years. But in any event, our opinion was, and still is, that it was a single purpose involved. Number one, Alabama didn't have the authority, even on the Alabama Constitution, to do it. We filed a lawsuit. It's still pending in the Circuit Court of Macon County. I don't know what's going to ultimately happen to the suit, but we think that land has reverted to the county, but we're still working on it. So that is that's the last, and I probably won't, and my son and other people in the office are working on it. And if any of you lawyers out there have some good ideas about how you can help us win it, we're available to accept your help.
So when the academicians this morning were talking about the importance of narrative, I think we see what exactly they meant when we hear from Attorney Gray. I'm not sure if we, Judge McCall, I mean, I'm not sure what our time frame is. If we have 10 minutes? Okay, I think we should open it up for questions then.
Thank you. Wow. I don't know about you, but I can stay here all afternoon and evening. Thank you, Mr. Gray, and thank you, Judge Thompson, for moderating. We do have a few minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Gray? Yes.
Mr. Gray, we know that judges can hurt you, but clerks can kill you. What was the nature of your relationship with the clerks in Alabama in the 50s that you
I
started your
didn't get the
practice?
first part of what you said.
I was saying that at least the common wisdom is that judges can hurt you, but clerks can kill you. And my question was, back in the 50s, practicing in Alabama, what was the nature of the black experience as it related to the clerks and the court staffs in Alabama?
Did you hear that?
Yeah. You want to repeat it for me?
Sure. What was your experience like? The clerks.
The clerks.
Oh. Yeah, I understand. The question is, what were my experience with the clerks of the courts? But I can tell you, I've had excellent experience with all the clerks in all of the courts, believe it or not, in federal or state courts, white or black. So what I try to always do, though, I didn't go into court as a civil rights advocate. I went into court as a lawyer for a client who think he has a cause, he or she has a cause of action. And all I want to do is just follow your rules and your regulations like any other matter before this court. And the mere fact that this is a racial issue should make no difference than if it was a personal injury. So I kept myself out of it. I tried to always be well prepared when I went to court so that I wouldn't have to take the criticism of the court for not being prepared. And I have had excellent relationship. As a matter of fact, and this brings up something else, when the Federal District Court in Montgomery, United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama, during the Civil Rights Movement, and it was all white at one time, when they decided that they were going to end up getting a black clerk, some of the officials called me and asked me about a person who might be able to serve. And I had a person in my office whose name is Miss Thomas, who was one of our best clerks. And while we needed her, I felt if the federal court wanted to use her, I would certainly tell them that they could look at her. They ended up contacting Miss Thomas. Miss Thomas resigned from us. Later, she became the first black work in the clerk's office. And later on, when Myron Thompson was appointed a federal district judge in Montgomery, he decided that he would take Miss Thomas as as his personal secretary in his office. And just 2 or 3 weeks ago, they unveiled a portrait of George Thompson showing when he took the bench, and Miss Thompson was there, and I was invited to be there. So we've had an excellent relationship with all of the officials in the court. That's a long way to tell it, but it does bring up what some of the issues are.
For the benefit.
And let me tell you one other part. Years later, in the Selma to Montgomery March, when Judge Thompson had ruled in favor of letting the march proceed, and when the state of Alabama, even before they filed a notice of appeal, told the rumor got out that they were going to appeal, and they were trying to set this march up within the next week, he called the lawyers into his office and said, I understand the government plans to appeal my decision. And he said, if you, based on that, I have set up a special 3-judge court of the old then Fifth Circuit down in New Orleans for 6 o'clock this evening. And so one of the lawyers for the government said, Judge, and then he told him, he said, there's a plane that leaves Montgomery going to New Orleans. And the lawyer said, did you make reservation for us? The judge said, no, we didn't, but we understand they have some space for you. Well, what happened was we went over, and that plane that was scheduled to fly was late getting in. John Doe, who worked with the Justice Department, who the judge had appointed the Justice Department to be a party plaintiff in this case now, against, in order to get the Selma to Montgomery March, he decided that the government was gonna charter a plane so he could go down for the hearing, because I represented the plaintiff, so I went along with him. The lawyers for the state went in the state plane. We went down, had our hearing. The court decided that night that Judge Johnson was correct and ordered that they proceed with the march. And by that time, when we came up to fly back, a cold front had come in on this plane that the government had chartered, and it couldn't go back. In the meantime, the federal government had sent planes of people from Washington to Montgomery at Maxwell Air Force Base, getting ready to protect the people for the march. And so John Doe got one of those planes to come down to New Orleans to pick him up, and of course I traveled along with him. And when I got to the airport, the sergeant who was with the transportation department at Maxwell Air Force Base was a person whose name was Willie Thomas, who was the husband of the young lady who used to be my secretary, and he ended up taking me home.
Anyone else have a question? Yes.
Hi, Attorney Gray. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been remarkable hearing all your stories and insights. So a lot of us in here, myself included, were current law students, and so I wanted to know if you had advice for young lawyers and when we're embarking on our legal careers.
Do you have any advice for young lawyers in their legal careers?
Whenever we're about ready to close out, I will cover what I think about the question about what young lawyers can do. The easy question first is, you may do what I did even before I got to be a lawyer, and that is look around your community and see what problems there are. And even better still, like what happened to me with Claudette Colvin and these other people, I didn't start any of these movements. These were people who came to me as a lawyer who had a problem, and I worked with them and helped them to solve them. So you lawyers have people who come in, because you also live in communities, you know what the problems are, and you look at them, analyze them. They're not easy problems, and they're not problems you may be able to solve. But if there are problems and people are having them, and you're a lawyer, and if you're worth the salt that you say you're worth, then you will talk to other people about it. Somebody may feel right. There may be other issues that will come up that people may feel that you don't have a right to. So you don't want to just go out there by yourself, but you want to try to get some support and then try to talk about it, come up with a plan, execute your plan, and who knows, you may be successful.
We do
Thank
have
you.
time.
They told me that we don't. Can we get one more hand for a stepping stone?
Let me mention one other thing. Thank you, but let me tell you a little something else. I started here, and maybe I'll just end here. I can get all my little papers together. The question then is, as you sit here, you want to put that up? That's right. Thank you. And I want to thank you very much. But you may be asking the question today is, where are we tonight? And that was the committee, and a few of us met and had dinner last night, and I looked at that group and said, this is good. But if we just don't do anything but just sit here and talk and go back home and do what we have done in the past, then we'll get what we've gotten in the past, and that's not much. The question is, as we sit here in Providence, Rhode Island, on whatever this date is, we should ask the question, where are we today? In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, racism and inequality are still, those are the two basic problems we had when slavery started. Racism and inequality. African Americans have been fighting against inequality and racism since we came in 1906. The clock is still ticking today as we reflect upon the progress we've made measurable improvement, but the question is, where do we go from here? Notwithstanding the progress in recent years, we have seen an surge in racism. We have seen an increase in police brutality, in the burning of churches, and the resurgence of hate groups all over the nation. This activity has increased during the last administration, resulting in the violent insurgent attack at the United States Capitol in January of 2021. The event set the stage for the January 6th committee public hearings, which ended just either this week or last week. I want to leave you with a challenge if you're serious about what you're doing. If what I have said to you and what I have done during my legal career of some 68 years means anything, it means, unfortunately, that this country still faces two major problems: the elimination of one, racism, and the elimination of inequality. If the life and work of Dr. King, Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, and Congressman John Lewis means anything, it means that the struggle continues for equal justice under the law, particularly for women and for minorities. And it continues. More importantly, it also means we must continue to work for the equality and for the end of racism. And we need to begin to do it and continue it now. It means that there is a real challenge as to whether the gains we have obtained will continue or whether we'll lose some of the ones we have obtained during the recent civil rights movement. If we lose, it means that Dr. King and all those others who have given their lives for the protection of human and civil rights would have died in vain. If we lose, this nation, the United States of America, loses. I leave you with a message that Congressman John Lewis, a great civil rights warrior, a nonviolent warrior, told me a few days before his death when we had a conversation on July the 8th, 2020. He had his administrator, his chief of staff, Mr. Collins, had called me. He wanted to talk to me once again, and he knew the end was near for him. And after we talked and we prayed, I asked the congressman, considering your great civil rights records, what do you want me to do? He said, brother, keep pushing, keep going, set the record straight. So I said, well, I realize that the court can only deal with matters that comes before it. I also realize that we as lawyers and officers of the court must do what we can, and we as citizens must do what we can. So I said to all of us, and to persons interested in civil rights, keep pushing, keep going, set the record straight, do it in a non-violent manner, and continue to do it until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you, and good afternoon.
On behalf of the Rhode Island Federal Court, the Rhode Island Federal Bar Association, and all of us Rhode Islanders, thank you so much, Mr. Gray. We do have a small gift and a token of our appreciation for you joining us today that Judge Tresvant from the Rhode Island State District Court would like to present.
Thank you.
What can I say? These are great words, and on behalf of the federal court, the state courts, I'd like to present this small token to Fred Gray, America's civil rights lawyer. With appreciation for being the keynote speaker for 2022 Rhode Island Federal District Court Conference. All the organizations here are greatly honored, and we're greatly honored by your presence, and thank you for your years of service. Thank you, Attorney Gray.